Greetings, everyone. Welcome to your Swedenborgian community online, your affirming interfaith community, hoping to uplift you wherever you're at, no matter your tradition or walk in life. We are called as a community, I believe, to uplift each other's health, the life, the goodness that's within everyone around us and within ourselves and society as well, as we let some of the more hurtful things, hurtful practices and ideas subside from each of our perspective. So with that, let us, before we begin our message, just take a few deep breaths, centering our spirit, our hearts on peace. Our question for the day is a big one. It's what happens when we die? A question that is reflected upon by many cultures, by many traditions and fictional accounts. We see it explored online a lot in things like near-death experiences, where people share what happened to them when they had cardiac arrest or something traumatic occurred. And honestly, I don't have any concrete answers. I'm not going to lay out a very specific idea, but I do want to explore some of the key themes and the consistencies between most of these major accounts. I think it's kind of fascinating. And it invites us to greater life, greater community connection, and love. Actually, this week I had my first memorial service on Tuesday for Dorothy Stoner, who was 94 when she passed. Many of you might have heard of her before. You might have even met her if you've been here for very long. I know there are some very close friends of Dorothy in the congregation. And I was quite inspired as I prepared for the Tuesday memorial, talking with her family and friends about all the wonderful ways of being that Dorothy exemplified. Because in a way, I couldn't help not knowing her, connect her to God, hearing about her joy, her patience and gratitude, her willingness to grow, to uplift others, and always going an extra mile to connect. It was quite amazing, and I was greatly honored to be a part of that service. And it got me thinking, well, what is the afterlife truly like? What is Dorothy experiencing right now? And I'm sure many of you know, having been a part of the Swedenborgian tradition for some time, if you have, that there's a lot about the spiritual realm in Swedenborg's explorations. And we also hear about the spiritual realm, the afterlife, in books of the dead, like the Tibetan books of the dead, in other texts of ancient traditions, like the Egyptian hieroglyphs. And we hear a little bit in Scripture, not a lot, just touches on a couple examples of what is happening to someone. But truly, if we were to look at these things and ask ourselves, well, what's the point of Swedenborg, for example, writing Heaven and Hell? What's the point of uplifting the afterlife? Well, I do think there's a level of comfort in thinking about the afterlife, in sharing details about it. But ultimately, the point that these sources often make is that they're sharing these details for our benefit, for our transformation, so that we may feel called to transform our hearts and our lives with eternity in mind. Our scripture today from Revelation was kind of a scary one, talking about God on a throne and the heavens fleeing from God. That's how it starts. And then it says the dead are arrayed in front of divinity, and their books are opened, and the book of life is opened, and they're judged. It's one of those moments in Revelation that I think cause many of us to shy away from the text. It doesn't help that Revelation is full of kind of psychedelic or trippy imagery, almost like a dream. You have dragons, you have beings with multiple faces and heads, and so many details about the environment that are hard to wrap our heads around. And in the beginning of that text, in the beginning of Revelation, John, the author, says, I was in the Spirit and saw these things. I was in the Spirit. Funny enough, that account, Revelation, fits really well with what we know about near-death experiences. A lot of people who've had near-death experiences also have had kind of crazy visions. Not as scary, perhaps, as that scriptural one. But often they'll see things that are almost like a dream, but they say they felt so real and were more consistent than any dream they've ever had. And yes, sometimes their books of life are opened, or in other words, they have a life review. In fact, that happened to me. I started, in a way, my journey to ministry with a near-death experience. To back up even further, for some context, I grew up hearing a lot about Scripture, about the Bible, about the afterlife, about God's judgment, like in our Scripture. And I was not much of a believer. In fact, I was a staunch atheist as far as I was concerned. I got a lot of church from my family. My grandfather's a Baptist minister. We attended a Salvation Army church. And my father, his son, was into all kinds of different religions, as I've shared in the past. And he would lecture me constantly about religion, and I was just like, enough. None of this, it doesn't fit together as far as I'm concerned. Your ideas about God don't make sense. My church is telling me everyone else is going to hell. That doesn't make sense. And so I didn't believe in anything. And I was in my early 20s as an atheist, out of college, and I collapsed. I was at a friend's house, thankfully, and I started convulsing on the ground. And I couldn't stop. It was weird because I was awake. It wasn't that I disappeared from reality. I could feel myself moving and shaking, and I started to have a life review. And I started to see milestones in my life. I started to see some detail around how I had behaved and how it had impacted others, both positively and negatively. And then I started to notice that the further back it got in my life review, because it seemed to be heading to my birth, the more bitter I discovered I was deep within. That for some reason, even as a young kid, I was kind of bitter against the world, against life. Seems kind of hard to believe, but this is what it was sharing with me. I don't know why that was, but it was a conviction that I carried forward, that perhaps I was more bitter than I thought. And then it continued, the vision, or whatever it was, continued, and I can't remember much of it. But like other near-death experiences, like Revelation, I remember that there was community aspects, that we had bodies, we had clothing, like Revelation describes the dead to have. I remember encountering others, and weirdly enough, parts of myself that I never would express externally came out. And I was behaving somewhat selfishly, dominatingly in this vision. What's interesting is that our scriptures, even the books of the dead, often talk about how in the next life that inner self comes out. As we reflect on our life and get down to the heart of what we're about, it comes out in community, in the community of the spiritual realm. A little weird to think about. Not something we talk about too often except in passing at this church. But I find it fascinating because it highlights that there is continued life and there is continued connection. But I think the more we look at these sources, actually the brighter the picture becomes. Because Emanuel Swedenborg, who explored many of these ideas in his writings, I don't know if he actually had the visions he said he had or not, but he talks about how, yes, the afterlife is kind of symbolic. You could call it trippy, but it's more concrete than any dream, as many people who've had near-death experiences say. You move around, you have a body, there's an environment. However, these things connect with your inner self. They, in fact, express part of your spirit in externality as how you look, what the room, what the natural elements around you look like. And in fact, we find our communities in the next life based on those inner qualities, based on shared internal environments, perhaps. In fact, we hear in psychology today that there's more and more of this type of visualization going on for our own internal transformation and health. Thinking about our minds almost from a third-person perspective as an environment, as a garden, as something that truly shapes our communities and our bodies. And Swedenborg says, I'm writing about this. In fact, Scripture talks about this to encourage us to look deep within and transform for the sake of community. Not just the community that we'll find ourselves in the next life in, but community today. Our story, our Scripture, talks about judgment. And often we can carry this idea of judgment that's really heavy, that feels like it's the end, perhaps even questioning if God works that way. Swedenborg explores Revelation himself, much as he does all Scripture. And he says, this is in fact a symbolic story about what happens to all of us on Judgment Day, quote unquote, on the day we die. And yes, sometimes in bigger collective experiences, he does talk about that. But in a way, there's a small Judgment Day often when we die. But it's not as judgmental as we might think. We dive deeply into our lives, into our hearts. And it calls on us to either transform for the positive or accept the negative if that is our mode of being. If we tend to be dominating, as it seemed like I might have been in my near-death experience, if we tend to be bitter, we can transform for the better. Often, what's at the core of our hearts, though, are hard to change, are hard to transform. And that's the warning that Scripture shares. The judgment of our own spiritual states. The possibility that we may continue to be hurtful, destructive, and selfish at our core. Or we can be called to greater life, greater warmth, and light. It's interesting because researching near-death experiences gets a little deep for me. And I don't want to go into too many details, but one thing that often occurs in these near-death experiences is that they see beings of light. And not just any light, but a light, a warmth that conveys love, that conveys connection and community. And they talk about how those beings pull them deeper within their greater loves, their higher selves. That these angels, you could call them, and some do call them that, connect with them as friends and invite them to lean in to health. And often near-death experiences shake people up so much that they come away from them feeling called to transform. That's what I felt in my near-death experience. I gave no credence to any of this. If I were out in the audience, I might think, well, it's a weird reflection, kind of strange enough to entertain, perhaps. But no credence would be given to it. And I think that's okay. I think that's okay. But this experience was so beyond my imagination that afterwards I thought to myself, well, there's way more going on than I could have ever imagined. There's way more to life than I could ever think possible on my own. Maybe that's true. It was definitely the case before. And I started to take seriously this idea that we might live forever, and that my internal environment shapes community, even today. Each of us has the things that we feel might be judged harshly, that might be hard to carry due to its destructiveness, its selfishness. And I invite all of us to think about what it would mean to live with that, with those practices, those hurtful modes of being forever, in a way that would be hard to hide from others, in a way that shapes our community, much like it more subtly shapes community today. Emanuel Swedenborg's book, Heaven and Hell, which is actually considered to be the first Western Book of the Dead by literary scholars, goes into all these details, many of which seem useless. Seems like why talk about beings that shed light, that give off warmth, much like we hear in near-death experiences? Why talk about God appearing in community and also as a sun if we're willing to be lit up by that sun? Why talk about all these symbolic things that we hear about in Revelation, that we hear about in other books of the Bible that are a little more psychedelic, a little more trippy? Well, when we start to think of ourselves as in community and in the environment that we make, we can find and start to find ways to dispel the clouds in front of that sun, to start to give off light and warmth in ways that we never had before, empowered by the idea that it's not from us, it's from God, it's from divinity. We're empowered by community, by the other beings of light around and within us, physically, spiritually. As many people share in their near-death experiences, they walk away assured, not fearful of the judgment as we might have been hearing about it from Revelation, but assured that they should actually be easier on themselves, leaning into health, and walking away from their hurtful intentions and destructive practices. I ask you to reflect on this for yourself, to think up one way that you can shed light and warmth a little more brightly today, tomorrow. And continue to do that. Continue to lean into your inspirations, your spiritual practices, the things that bring health into your life. For some people, it might be reflecting on near-death experiences. For many of us, it's things like meditation, community connection. Because that's what it's all about. Leaning into health, into community, and transformation. Now let us close our eyes, breathing deeply. allowing ourselves to come into the present moment, letting go of our thoughts, but allowing them to still come. Noticing the life within, the type of spiritual environment that we're called on to help shape, empowered by God. Now visualize yourself as an angel. Emanuel Swedenborg believed that angels were just people in heaven. Allow yourself to feel that calling to the aspects of that angel that you can grow into. Imagine what that higher self would be about. What that higher self would shape in her environment. And what they would let go of, knowing that those things that might be hurtful are not them, just as the light and warmth that they share are not them, but are the rightful gifts, the intentional blessings from divinity. So I'm curious what you all think about this topic, think about this message, what your idea of the afterlife is, if you have one, your opinion on whether or not there is one. And please reach out to us if you want to share. You can post comments wherever you find this, of course, and you can reach out to us on our website at Swedenborgiancommunity.org. And let us, just keeping in mind the things that have been illuminated for us or inspired for us, as we listen to some music from Lori Turley, allowing our meditative breathing to connect with us and allowing our minds to stay as much in the present moment as possible. It's easy to get distracted, so I invite you to use the sounds, use the distractions as ways to pull you into now, the moment that is always present.
It was early in the evening when the sun had lost its flame. I gathered wildflowers, calling each of them by name. I sat beside a stream I'd always fancied as a moat, tossing petals on the water just to see how long they'd float. It was mountain blue and silver with a touch of apple green, golden as my flowers and the sunlight and the grain, purple as the violet and the clover's fluffy crown, and raven as the branches of the evening settling down. Then I heard a sound of anger and voices harsh and cruel, the blasting of a shotgun and the laughter of a fool. I saw not far above me a bird with bleeding wing, plummet to the ground before me, a struggling, helpless thing. As I rushed to hold it near me, its body warm with fright, I could feel the sunlight fading as the evening turned to night. In one last hasty moment ere the sun could go to rest, I stared in blank amazement at the colors on its breast. They were mountain blue and silver with a spark of emerald green, golden as the heavens where this starling took its name, purple as the shimmer of a royal maiden's gown, and raven as the branches of the evening settling down. Well, I laid it in the shadow of a little sapling tree. I heard my elders laugh, their voices heavy on the breeze. But I held my angry words, I let the sorrow be my own. For the death of one small starling was a loss they could not know. Oh, the mountain blue and silver were the colors of the night, and the golden stars above me showed my homeward path a light. The purple hazy shadows settled down the night to stay, and the raven black of midnight helped to soothe me on my way.
Well, that's a beautiful song from Lori Turley, as they always are. It's an interesting topic, the afterlife, what happens when we pass away. I know for some people it's really set in stone. And they use the idea of the afterlife, maybe not details about it, except in broad strokes, but they use this idea and their concrete attachment to it, their idea of it, as reason to condemn others. In fact, as the condemnation itself, that there's a damnation for those who don't agree with them, for those who have differing opinions about the name of God, the book where God speaks out of, the tradition that God is with. And so we each may carry aspects of that in a way. And a lot of us have been impacted by that in religious contexts. And I think that leaning into more malleability around the mystery, even if we explore some of the commonalities of accounts, is healthy. I think also we have to have compassion for the part of us and the part of other people that center on that in such a hurtful, destructive way. They may not find it to be hurtful, but often when we use our religion as a type of bat against others, and we dismiss our family, maybe even stop speaking to someone because they leave our church or leave our spiritual abode, it's quite destructive, and it's often what I think Christ tried to uplift isn't healthy, hurting others with our religion. Now that's my opinion, and so take it with the grain of salt you will hopefully take it with, but it's cool to know there's other people out there that are supportive of the diversity around us. It's cool to know that you have a deep openness to your own walk in love and light. And so continue on the way you've been continuing, leaning into health, into wisdom, into love, knowing that there's always another day, most probably, and there's always room to grow. So don't be too hard on yourself, but engage with the present moment, allowing the light and warmth of divinity to transform your spirit, the insight, the compassion of your experience, of your higher power, the universe, if you would like to call it that, influence you, pull you towards greater and greater expression of your higher self, of the love and light that is always just starting to shine within. All right, folks. Well, thanks for connecting with us, and thanks especially to those of you who connect live. If you ever want to connect live, we are now on Zoom, so we chat. We can see each other if we want, hear each other. Although often we just use the text function with the Zoom communication. And you can find out how to connect in that way live on Sundays and Thursdays at our website, Swedenborgiancommunity.org. If you're on YouTube, please subscribe, hit the bell. We love connecting with you, and we'd love to be able to continue sharing with you. And also, just know that you are quite loved, and that a higher power beyond our imagination, a universe beyond our understanding, empowers every one of your steps. Bye.